That's James Ham. I'm Kyle Madsen, and joining us now from the Action Network, you can also hear him on the Buckets podcast. Subscribe to that wherever you get your pods. Matt Moore at HP Basketball on Twitter. Matt, thanks so much for hopping on with us, man. How are you?
Good, man. Thanks for having me. Appreciate you guys having me on.
Yeah, of course. So you wrote in the Action Network. You wrote a whole notebook of off-season notes, and one of the things that was in there that jumped out to us here in Sacramento was that the Kings have called the Bulls about Zach LaVine. My immediate question on that is that like a recent thing, or has that been an ongoing discussion between those two clubs? What have you been hearing there?
Yeah, I think there were discussions back at the trade deadline. Based off what I heard, that there were some conversations that happened at the trade deadlines. The Bulls desperately tried to develop a market for Zach LaVine. I think they've kind of been revisited with the Kings still looking at various options for moves this summer. And so I think this is one of the things I think is hard to tell is when you get information off. I can't count how many times it's been. I'll follow up on something with someone and be like, "Hey, I heard this." I'm like, "Well, yeah, that definitely happened 6 weeks ago." And then you're like, okay, cool, just checking in. So trying to figure out like what's the most recent thing I think is really difficult. But I do think those conversations have been going on because honestly, a lot of the time, not always, there's always things where it just happens very immediately. But a lot of the times there's deals that are revisited, that are brought up during the trade deadline, and then they can't get something done, and then they're brought back up in the summer. You have more time to kind of work it out, and you understand a little bit more of where your team's at, so you get to kind of think on it for a few months, and that happens pretty commonly, I think, in the league.
Yeah, Matt, I know that I had heard a lot about Zach potentially coming to Sacramento, or at least the idea of it early in the season before he got hurt. And, we started hearing that Zach would love to pair with De'Aaron Fox in the backcourt. And this is, of course, after LaVine years earlier had signed an offer sheet with the Kings. The Bulls matched and he went back and then was like, hey, I'm so glad I didn't get stuck in Sacramento. And so I think it's interesting because these deals do take a long time. But just as a player, the problem I've always had with Zach, and I like the offensive game. I like his playmaking. Like, I think he has a lot of positive attributes. But two things stand out. Number one, he can't stay healthy at all. And number two, his contract is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I just, do those things make him, whether it's the Kings or someone else, do they make him one of the hardest players in the league to actually find a trade partner for?
Yeah, I think so. I think the contract in particular is just really bad for trying to get somebody to want to invest that kind of money to tie up that kind of cap space, especially given the new apron rules, right? Like everybody's really scared of getting close to the apron. So if you're going to add a guy like that, you've got to feel like Zach LaVine is a guy that's going to be a pillar for your team. And there's not a lot of confidence that he is that. The injury stuff, I think, is pretty variable. I think there's concerns. Obviously, he's had a pretty bad injury history, but we've seen guys move past those in their careers, and I don't think that LaVine's so reliant on his athleticism that it's going to decline at an extremely high rate. The other thing I think that really happened to him, honestly, was I'm on a little bit of an island on this. I think that DeMar DeRozan going to that team was one of the worst things in the world for him. He had revamped his shot selection. He had become much more of a playmaker. He'd become much more of a dynamic, efficient player that led to like better offense. And then DeMar got there, and it was like slowly over time. In the beginning, they were sharing duties, and then DeMar just kept taking more and more and more and more usage. And the problem with DeMar is with the mid-range stuff is like all of your spacing is cramped and you just can't really do it. And when you have Vucevic, now it's like you have a mid-range guy and you have a guy usually in the paint, or if not, it's just a big kind of rotating up and pick and pop spots. And it wasn't really the kind of system I think that allows for LaVine to be what he's really great at, which is being a really explosive three-level scorer who can also make really great reads. He wasn't able to be that guy with DeRozan. And so I think that really limited his upside, where now, he's thought of as like the defensive liability, just kind of a gunner. Why are you going to pay this much for him? When he was on track for I thought he was like all NBA borderline before DeMar's season where he got there. So I think that there's still like a lot of upside for him. Now that was several years ago, so maybe not. But I do think that LaVine right now is a little bit underrated by where the market's at, in part because of how people view that contract.
Matt Moore, the Action Network. You can also check him out on the Buckets podcast. So do you think that there will be a trade market for LaVine this offseason?
I think they're going to move him. I think yesterday kind of shows the willingness of that front office in Chicago to just basically do a deal and just reshape it. They want to reshape that team for a number of reasons. Everything I've heard is that DeMar DeRozan's going to be back, that they're going to re-sign him on a huge deal, and they're going to build around DeRozan, which good luck to you. But I do think that LaVine's going to be gone, and I think there's enough teams looking for scoring options between. I think the Wizards are actually a team that's interested in LaVine. I think that the Magic are at least willing to have those conversations because they do understand the need for them to add some scoring punch. I think you look at some other teams that might be willing to be like, hey, this could be a really good move for us if we get the right deal. Especially because if Chicago's going to set the kind of terms that they did with Caruso, I think there's a pretty good opportunity there to get a buy low spot on LaVine. And it doesn't sound like the Bulls are dead set on getting great value return, which is going to make it interesting if the Kings decide to keep those conversations up, or if they return to them, if they're dormant, of exactly, how much do you have to give up? Because the Kings have a very good trade package that I've heard that is being offered around, and I don't necessarily know they have to give up all those pieces in order to get Zach LaVine outside of just satisfying the salary requirements.
Yeah, the salary requirements are, I mean, it's crazy because you're going to basically have to package, 3 players probably. I mean, we've heard, whether it was last year or even like midway through the year, the package of Herter and Barnes being shopped. It's something that you also reported. The one question I had for you is, when you heard your information, you mentioned both Caruso and LaVine. And was that something like as a package? Because it seems to me that LaVine's contract is so prohibitive for most teams that you might have had to give up a Caruso to move off of LaVine. And that's something that kind of stood out for me with your reporting specifically, that it was both of them that the Kings were interested in.
Yeah, so I think that it was kind of a we'll take the LaVine contract, but we're going to need Caruso along with it. And this goes into something that an executive told me. I talked about this with an exec last summer. He said, one of the problems that you run into in trades is it's hard when you have an asset that the other team knows is available, because if it's just like you have that asset, they're going to want that regardless, even if you're like, but that's not part of this deal. I don't want that as part of this deal. They're like, well, you have it, so you need to include it. And so that's one of the things I think that actually kind of switches here is the Kings now have to decide, like, is the LaVine deal, and other teams have to too, that I think we're involved in. There were 2 teams I don't know of that had also called about this package of LaVine and Caruso that I think now you have to evaluate, do you still want this? Because now it's like, you can't ask for Caruso, he's gone. You can't get Caruso with this deal anymore, but you can still pull this deal off, and you can't add LaVine. Even if you take off some of the assets for it, do you still want that deal? Or were you only in it to try and get Caruso? Now, the Bulls, I think, manhandled this in terms of what they got for Caruso, but I do wonder how that impacts the conversations about LaVine, because you no longer have to resist including Caruso in a deal because he's already gone.
Talking with Matt Moore of the Action Network. Also, check him out on the Buckets podcast. We've been talking a lot about Malik Monk today here in Sacramento. Of course, if anyone missed it, 4 years, $78 million for Malik Monk to return to the Kings. I'm wondering if this tracks for you, because it felt like the Orlando Magic were the team that was most likely to offer Monk a deal in the range of 4 years and $100 million. We'll just call it that. And when you look at his skill set and kind of what they needed, it's like, man, that would be a really perfect fit. But then he agrees to re-sign with the Kings before ever officially exploring the free agent market. Do you think that had anything to do with the contract he was going to get from the Magic, or is that an indicator that the Magic went, yeah, we like you, but we're really, really going to pursue Klay Thompson first, and then we'll get back to you when that's settled?
I actually think it has more to do, I think, with a testament to Sacramento's culture of them having built an environment where players want to make these kind of decisions and stay because they want to be part of something where they can compete at the level that they want with the guys that they want. And the reason I say that is, like, I don't think Orlando was I don't even think Orlando was the highest bidder. Now, a lot of the way that this works out is sometimes it's the players' representation is spreading stuff. And so, yeah, no, there was this offer for X amount of dollars that later you ask and they're like, no, that was never out there. But my understanding was that Detroit and Charlotte were both willing to make huge offers for Monk, like very considerable offers, north of 100 million for Monk. And that what wound up happening, and like there was a shock in the league circles I talked to last night of he didn't even he left so much money on the table to come back to Sac. Now, maybe that's not true. Maybe Monk's value on the market, maybe that shifted in the last couple of days. And I have heard things about Charlotte maybe pivoting to taking on being more of a rebuild situation where they want to take on bad contracts in exchange for assets. And if you're doing that, you don't necessarily want to hand out that kind of money. So that maybe that's one of the things that shifted in the last couple of weeks. But my understanding was like he was going to have no problem getting an offer north of what the Kings could max out offer. And so the fact that he came back, like I have to attribute that to how much they've done to endear that kind of response from the players, that there's that kind of trust and support. So really, I think it's a testament to Sacramento and to what Malik wants for his career, because you just don't see guys leave money on the table very often. And at least from my vantage point, I think he did.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take. And, to be honest, we heard some murmurs earlier in the day that was very true, that there was a potential deal out there that was north of 100 million or 20 million plus more than what the Kings could offer. And so it started to get a little dark and gloomy. And then to see the tweet come through was pretty crazy. You also mentioned Kyle Kuzma in your piece with regards to the Kings. Where is this at? Because this has been, I mean, from the time that he was almost traded for Buddy Hield, along with Montrezl Harrell from the Lakers, to even last summer, Kuzma and the Kings has been like this weird on the outskirts, just never gets consummated type deal. Where are you at? What are you hearing with this?
So I'd actually heard that some of those conversations were a three-way deal with Chicago, that it was going to involve either LaVine and Kuzma both coming to Sac, which I thought that was a bit much given the requirements where the roster's at. So that didn't make much sense to me. Or that LaVine was going to wind up in Washington, and then Kuzma goes with Caruso to the Kings. With Caruso, I think that changes some of that dynamic. I do know that Washington, I think, has at least some interest in LaVine, and which is crazy given the Jordan Poole situation, but it is what it is. But I do think that, look, I think Kuzma is going to continue to be an option tied to the Kings for quite a while. I think that there's a willingness on both sides from Kuzma, and the Kings are interested in him as a player, and Kuzma, I think, is interested in the Kings as an organization to facilitate that. But this may also wind up being one of those where my inclination is that it probably won't happen based off of the fact that I think Washington values Kuzma a little bit more than the market does. That's pretty common, right? Everyone likes their own players more than the market does. And if you're looking for a King's ransom for, pardon the pun, for Kuzma, I don't think you're really going to get it. I think that the Barnes Herter draft pick is honestly, with Caruso going for no picks, like I'm very curious to see what happens with the market now, because now you have this player that everybody was like, man, we would love to have Alex Caruso, and not getting a single pick for it. That has impacts on these other things. So now I think it's hard for you to be like, yeah, we'll throw in a pick for this other guy who may not be as impactful. Not necessarily saying that's Kuzma, because Kuzma is more of an offensive guy, and a little bit more balanced. And I think he has better defensive days in front of him on teams that aren't, the Wizards. So I think there's a lot of upside there, but I do think that there's enough for those conversations to keep intact. And even if it may end up happening that the Kings are involved in a three-way trade and Kuzma winds up going back, I think that those kind of conversations, I think, will probably continue as we get closer to the end of free agency.
Matt Moore, this is great stuff. Everybody make sure to follow along at HP Basketball on Twitter. You can find his work at the Action Network. You can also hear him on the Buckets podcast, wherever you get your pods. Matt, this is great. Thank you so much for stopping by, man.
Thanks for having me.
Good seeing you, buddy.